There is a sentence sitting inside a Microsoft press release right now that should make every Linux user on Earth stop scrolling, because it means the company that once compared open source software to a disease is now the one manufacturing it. And if that sentence doesn't unsettle you a little, you haven't understood what just happened. Picture the room. Minneapolis, the 18th of May, 2026, the Open Source Summit in North America, a stage full of the kind of engineers who spent their careers defending Linux from exactly the company now standing in front of them. And up walks Brendan Burns, a Microsoft technical fellow, a man who literally co-founded Kubernetes, and he says two things back to back that land like a gut punch to anyone who remembers the 1990s. Azure Linux 4.0 in preview, running on Azure virtual machines, and Azure Container Linux, an immutable, container-optimized operating system, generally available, shipping today. Not a demo, not a roadmap slide. Live. And if you think that announcement was contained to one keynote in one city, you're wrong, because 2 weeks later at Microsoft Build on June 2nd, the company didn't just repeat itself, it widened the entire story, folding Kubernetes support, Windows subsystem for Linux integration, and an entire hardware lineup into one enormous vision. A vision where Windows becomes the front door of your computer and Linux becomes the engine quietly running the building underneath it. So here's the question that should be sitting in your chest right now, uncomfortable, unresolved, the kind of question this video is going to force you to actually answer instead of just feel, is this the moment open source finally won? The day the biggest software company on the planet surrendered completely to the community it once tried to destroy? Or is this something far more calculated, something with a much older, much colder name? Because before you get excited, before you let yourself believe this is some kind of redemption arc, you need to understand exactly who is standing on that stage and what that company has done every single time it has ever gotten close to something it didn't own. Rewind with me. 2001, a room full of reporters, Steve Ballmer, Microsoft's chief executive at the time, red-faced, animated, calling Linux a cancer, using the exact phrase that it attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That wasn't some fringe employee mouthing off. That was the CEO. That was the official temperature of the entire company toward the operating system it is now building, branding, and shipping in 2026. For nearly 2 decades after that, Microsoft treated open source the way a fortress treats a siege, funding lobbying campaigns against it, pushing proprietary alternatives into every open standard it came near, protecting the Windows and Office monopoly like the last 2 kingdoms on Earth. And then, quietly, something cracked. 2014. Satya Nadella takes the wheel as CEO, and in a moment that still feels almost surreal if you were paying attention at the time, he stands up and says the words nobody thought a Microsoft executive would ever say out loud. Microsoft loves Linux. 2016, Windows subsystem for Linux arrives, letting developers run a real Linux environment inside Windows for the first time. 20s. 18, Microsoft buys GitHub, the single largest code hosting platform on the entire planet, the place where open source literally lives. The company becomes one of the top corporate contributors to the Linux kernel itself. It open sources .NET, PowerShell, Visual Studio Code, tools that used to be locked behind Microsoft's walls. For a generation of developers who grew up watching Microsoft as the enemy, this transformation already felt disorienting, almost too good to be true. And now in 2026, the company goes several steps further than anyone predicted, building an entire Linux distribution from the ground up, one it owns, maintains, patches, and controls end to end. So if you're feeling whiplash right now, if part of you wants to cheer and part of you wants to reach for a healthy dose of suspicion, that reaction is not naive, it is earned, because history has taught an entire generation of developers exactly what it looks like when Microsoft embraces something it used to fight. Let's slow down and get precise about what actually shipped, because most of the coverage online has been sloppy, and the details are exactly where the real story is hiding in plain sight. Azure Linux 4.0 is a Fedora derived RPM-based general-purpose server distribution, built from a snapshot of Fedora 43, developed completely in the open on GitHub, where anyone can watch the commits land in real time. According to Microsoft's own engineering team, this is not a fork that quietly walks away from Fedora and starts drifting into its own private universe. It applies targeted, documented overlays on top of upstream Fedora packages, staying embedded inside the existing lineage rather than cutting itself loose. And here's the detail that almost nobody is talking about, the one that genuinely surprised me while digging through this story. Reporting from InfoQ reveals that Microsoft's own engineers had originally floated the idea of forking Fedora outright, breaking away entirely, before being steered back towards staying inside the broader Fedora ecosystem instead. Sit with that for a second, because it means somewhere inside. Microsoft, a decision was made, deliberately, to keep this project tethered to the same open community that eventually gave the world Red Hat's Fedora Core OS after Red Hat acquired Core OS back in 2018. Which means, in one of the strangest twists of corporate genealogy you'll ever hear, Microsoft and Red Hat are now both building products descended from the exact same great-grandparent operating system, separated by years, ownership, and an entire ocean of corporate history, yet standing on the same root. This isn't a hobby project quietly humming away in some forgotten research lab either. Burns was blunt on that Minneapolis stage about exactly why this exists right now, in this moment, and not 5 years ago or 5 years from now. Open source, he said, is the foundation for artificial intelligence. And as AI workloads scale across Azure, developers need that foundation to be more secure, more predictable, and easier to build agents on top of. And then comes the number that explains everything else in this story, the single statistic that should recontextualize every headline you've read. How about this announcement? According to Microsoft's own published figures, more than 2 out of every 3 compute cores running on Azure today are running Linux, not Windows. Microsoft 365, GitHub, even the infrastructure scaling ChatGPT itself across more than 10 million compute cores, all built on a Linux foundation. Read that again, slowly. 2/3 of the workloads running on Microsoft's own cloud platform are not running Microsoft's own operating system. That single fact is the real engine behind everything that follows, because it explains, with brutal clarity, why a company that spent 20 years fighting Linux is now racing to build, brand, and quietly claim ownership over its own version of it. And once you understand that motivation, the question sharpens into something far more pointed than a simple yes or no. Is Microsoft doing this because it genuinely wants to strengthen an ecosystem it now depends on for survival, or because it wants to own the one layer of that ecosystem it has never fully controlled? That question has a name in tech history, and if you've been paying attention long enough, you already felt your stomach tighten the moment you read it. Embrace, extend, extinguish. This isn't internet slang cooked up by angry forum posters. It is a documented internal Microsoft strategy from the 1990s, surfaced through the Comes versus Microsoft antitrust litigation, and it describes, in cold, procedural language, a 3-step playbook the company has run again and again against open standards and rival technologies. Step 1, embrace. Adopt the competing technology publicly. Build compatibility. Tell developers, tell the press, tell the world that you believe in it. Step 2, extend. Start layering proprietary features on top of that open foundation. Features that are genuinely useful, features that make your version more convenient than the plain. Original, features that quietly, gradually, require your ecosystem to keep everything running smoothly. Step 3, extinguish. Over years, not overnight, the open original slowly becomes the inferior choice, not because anyone banned it or forced anyone off it, but because the market simply drifted toward the more convenient, more integrated version, and the people who stuck with the plain, open standard found themselves standing alone at a permanent disadvantage. This is not theoretical. Microsoft ran this exact play against Kerberos authentication in the late 90s, quietly adding proprietary extensions that broke cross-platforms, compatibility with everyone else's implementation. It ran the play against Java, building its own divergent virtual machine until a federal court forced the company to stop in 2001. It ran the play with Internet Explorer in the early 2000s, an era when an entire generation of websites had to slap the words best viewed in Internet Explorer across their homepage because the company's proprietary HTML extensions had fractured the open web standard into pieces. It ran a version of the same play with document formats pushing its own OXML standard directly against the open document format that European governments and open source advocates had rallied behind. None of this is rumor. It's documented corporate history sitting in court records, and it's exactly why so many longtime open source developers reacted to the Azure Linux announcement not with celebration, but with a tired, knowing kind of skepticism, the look of people who have seen this movie before and already know how certain scenes tend to play out. So here's the uncomfortable question this video actually has to answer, point by point, no shortcuts. Does Azure Linux 4.0 fit that same 3-step pattern, or is this genuinely something different? Step 1, embrace. And here, the evidence is honestly stronger than most people expected. Building transparently from Fedora 43, contributing fixes back upstream instead of walling itself off into a private silo is a real, verifiable embrace of an open standard, not a cosmetic gesture designed to look good in a press release. Step 2, extend, and this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, depending on which side of this you're standing on. Azure Linux 4.0 ships with deep, exclusive integration into Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Azure Monitor, Microsoft Entra ID for identity and access management, and Azure's trusted launch security framework. none of which are available with the same tight coupling on Ubuntu, on Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, or on any third-party distribution running on that exact same Azure infrastructure. That is a real, measurable extension layer, and Microsoft alone controls every piece of it. Step 3, Extinguish. As of right now, in the middle of 2026, this has simply not happened. Red Hat is not disappearing. IBM, which paid $34 billion to acquire Red Hat back in 2019, is not walking away from that bet. Canonical's Ubuntu remains, by a wide margin, the most commonly chosen Linux distribution on Azure, chosen organically by developers themselves, not pushed onto them by Microsoft's defaults. So no, Extinguish has not arrived, not yet, and arguably it isn't even close. But here's the part of this pattern that almost nobody talks about, the part that should genuinely worry you more than any dramatic headline ever could. The Extinguish phase was never designed to look like an attack. It was designed to look like convenience. It happens slowly, over years, as customers quietly drift toward the more tightly integrated option, not because anyone forced them, but because it was simply easier, cheaper, and better supported. And by the time anyone actually notices the alternative ecosystem has thinned out, it's already happened, invisibly, one convenient default at a time. Which brings us to the part of this story almost nobody's willing to say plainly out loud, the part where all the strategic language dissolves into something much simpler. Money. Every single time an enterprise customer spins up a Red Hat Enterprise Linux instance on Azure, Red Hat collects a support subscription, and Microsoft simply rents out the underlying compute. Every time a customer chooses Ubuntu instead, Canonical collects revenue through its own commercial contracts. Microsoft owns the data centers, the hardware, the networking, the entire physical and virtual stack beneath all of it. And yet a meaningful slice of the software revenue flowing on top of that infrastructure lands in someone else's pocket. Azure Linux rewrites that entire equation. If even a modest percentage of Azure's Linux workloads migrate toward Microsoft's own distribution, Microsoft captures revenue and strategic control across the whole stack, from silicon to operating system to security patching to compliance certification, instead of splitting that value with Red Hat or Canonical ever again. And there's a second driver here, quieter, less headline-friendly, but arguably even more important, supply chain security. When a customer runs a third-party distribution on Azure, Microsoft cannot fully guarantee the provenance of every binary sitting inside that customer's environment, and it cannot fast-track a critical vulnerability patch across an entire fleet on its own timeline. With Azure Linux, Microsoft controls that supply chain from top to bottom. Every package cryptographically signed, software bills of materials published for every release, detailed manifests listing every component inside every piece of software shipped. For regulated industries, banking, healthcare, government contracting, where regulators are increasingly demanding exactly this kind of transparency, that single vendor accountability model isn't a nice-to-have feature anymore. It's becoming close to a requirement, and whoever owns that requirement owns the next decade of enterprise cloud contracts. So before we get to what this actually means for the companies standing directly in Microsoft's path, sit with that number one more time. 2/3 of Azure's customer cores are already running on Linux instead of Windows right now in the middle of 2026, not as some future prediction, but as the current reality of Microsoft's own cloud. And that single fact is the thread that ties everything else in this story together. Let's talk about who actually gets hurt here, because abstract strategy talk only goes so far, and the most exposed player in this entire story, by a wide margin, is Red Hat. Red Hat Enterprise Linux has been the gold standard enterprise-grade distribution for years. The operating system that banks, hospitals, airlines, and government agencies built entire compliance frameworks around. And Red Hat's business model depends almost entirely on customers paying recurring subscriptions for that hardened, certified environment. Azure Linux 4.0 is now, for the first time in history, a direct competitor to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, specifically on Azure, not on premises, not on Amazon, not on Google Cloud, but on the one platform where Microsoft controls literally every layer of the stack from the silicon up. And the pitch to customers writing that renewal check is brutally simple. Why keep it paying for a separate Red Hat subscription when Microsoft will hand you a free, security-hardened, Microsoft-supported alternative running on the exact same infrastructure you're already paying for? For Azure native customers, without a strong need for Red Hat's broader cross-platform certification ecosystem, that pitch is genuinely compelling, and it directly threatens a meaningful slice of Red Hat's Azure-based revenue that IBM was partly betting on when it spent $34 billion acquiring the company back in 2019. Canonical's position is more complicated. because Ubuntu's popularity on Azure is the result of organic developer preference, not anything Microsoft engineered, and developers gravitate toward Ubuntu for its enormous software ecosystem, its documentation, its general developer friendliness, none of which Azure Linux is really built to compete for head-on. Azure Linux is positioned as infrastructure plumbing, the operating system quietly running underneath your workloads, not the operating system your developers are actively coding on top of every single day. But there's a longer-term risk here that's much harder to see coming, and it's the one worth paying the closest attention to. If Azure Linux becomes the default for new Kubernetes node pools, the default for fresh virtual machines, the default base image for new containers, and if developers simultaneously start running Azure Linux inside Windows Subsystem for Linux, specifically because it now matches what's running in production, Canonical starts losing mindshare at every single layer of the development pipeline at once, from the laptop all the way down to the data center. And this is precisely the pitch Microsoft is making in plain language right now in its own developer documentation. Develop locally on the exact same Linux distribution you deploy to in production, and eliminate the classic, it works on my machine problem for good. That isn't a subtle marketing angle. That's a direct, deliberate appeal to every developer who currently defaults to Ubuntu inside WSL without thinking twice about it. And if that pitch lands the way Microsoft hopes it will, this entire story stops being purely about back-end infrastructure and becomes a full-blown developer experience war instead. Which brings us to the piece of Microsoft's Build 2026 announcement most likely to actually change how developers behave every single day, not just some quiet decision made deep inside a cloud dashboard. Microsoft is now shipping native curtils for Windows, built on a modern, memory-safe Rust re-implementation of the classic Unix toolkit, bringing commands like ls, grep, sed, and awk natively onto Windows without needing WSL running at all. Pair that with the new WSL container system, WSL-C, a lightweight Docker-like way to build and run Linux containers directly inside Windows, and suddenly the full shape of the strategy comes into focus. Build on Windows, test inside Linux containers locally, deploy straight to Azure Linux in production with a consistent environment the entire way through. No seams, no translation layer, no surprises. It's worth remembering this is almost exactly the pitch Docker made roughly a decade ago, and it worked. Because solving the "it works on my machine" problem remains one of the most persistent, genuinely painful frustrations in professional software development, the kind of pain developers will change their entire workflow to make disappear. The open question, and nobody has a confident answer to yet, is whether this actually grows the Linux ecosystem by lowering the barrier to entry for Windows native developers who might never have touched a terminal otherwise, or whether it does the exact opposite, giving developers just enough of a Linux-like experience inside Windows that they never feel the pull to fully switch platforms at all, permanently trapped in a comfortable middle ground that never quite becomes the real thing. And then there's the announcement that genuinely surprised even seasoned industry analysts who thought they'd seen everything Build had to offer, the Surface RTX Spark DevBox, a high-end AI workstation built around roughly 128 gigabytes of unified memory, claimed performance approaching a full petaflop of AI compute, and the ability to run local AI models with well over 100 billion. Parameters sitting right there on your desk. It ships pre-configured with Windows Subsystem for Linux, native GPU, pass-through for full NVIDIA CUDA support, Visual Studio Code, and GitHub Copilot baked in from the very first boot. Microsoft is openly describing it as a desktop data center for running complex AI agent workflows locally. And the intended workflow tells you everything you need to know about where this is really headed. Windows sits as the host operating system on the Surface, technically the front door. But the actual AI development work happens almost entirely inside Linux, either through WSL directly or through these new Linux containers with near-native GPU access. Pricing hasn't been officially confirmed, but given the spec sheet, expect this to land firmly in professional workstation territory, several $1,000s at minimum, aimed squarely at the same audience currently buying Apple Silicon Macs and native Linux workstations for exactly this kind of work. What this hardware announcement really tells you is that Microsoft isn't just fighting for the cloud server market anymore. It's trying to capture the entire AI developer's workflow from the workstation upward, competing directly against the two platforms that have quietly dominated serious AI development for years. And that brings us, finally, to the question that actually brought you here in the first place, the one you've been waiting for through every twist of this story. Should you be worried? Here's my honest, no-spin verdict after going through every official announcement, every technical document, every piece of independent reporting on this entire saga. The answer is not yet, and quite possibly not ever, but pretending the structural conditions that could lead there aren't real would be dishonest, and I'm not going to do that to you. Running the embrace, extend, extinguish framework point by point one final time. Microsoft has genuinely embraced an open standard, building transparently on Fedora and contributing real code back upstream instead of quietly forking away into isolation. Microsoft has also genuinely extended that foundation, layering exclusive integrations like Defender for Cloud, Azure Monitor, and Entra ID on top in ways no competing distribution can match on that same infrastructure. But the third and most dangerous phase, Extinguish, simply has not happened. Red Hat remains a business built on a $34 billion acquisition operating at full strength. Canonical's Ubuntu remains the developer's organic first choice on Azure, chosen freely, not by default. Nobody has been forced off their existing distribution. Not one enterprise, not one developer, not yet. Which means the honest verdict here isn't panic and it isn't blind celebration either. It's vigilance. It's understanding exactly which chapter of this story we're actually living in right now, so that if the next chapter ever starts to arrive, you're not the last person in the room to notice it happening.